So the Prisma pencil does not erase very well, right? So you want to build it up slowly. You can lighten it, like you can even just take a kneaded eraser and press down on it, and it will lighten the tone, or in the case of the white, darken it. But the key to this approach with it is you're used to drawing things where you go progressively darker, usually, using graphite or charcoal or something like that. Now you're actually going to be using a Prisma pencil that the more you put down, it gets lighter. For some reason, also the white, when people use it, it tends to get too heavy because they're not thinking in terms of gradual shifts so much with it, and they end up sort of like coloring with it, where wherever they use white, it's like white, full bore. And you want to build it up slowly. The best approach, since I'm going to have this is going to be my middle tone. So some of this skull is going to stay the brown of the paper. So what I'm going to do is work from both ends to the middle. So I'm going to pick the lightest areas, like here on the top of the bridge of the nose, on the skull right there where I have like a highlight, the edge of some of these, the thickness of the bone, top of the teeth. Those are going to be kind of my lightest tones, top of the eyebrow. So I'm going to actually start with those. And I always like starting with the white because it's a little more forgiving. The Prisma pencil just makes a really nice tone, and the texture on this paper is pretty decent also. So this brow kind of fades up, top of the nose. And then I've got this really thin, light edge, the thickness of that nasal cavity coming down. And it kind of comes and goes, like it's not an even white line. In some places it bends away from the light a little bit, so I have this where it gets brighter, and then kind of darker, and then bright again. The center of this bone, that thickness, is actually a little brighter than the outside edges, so I'm just bringing that up. This one got a little bit. Get rid of that charcoal in there. It's kind of interfering with my light tone. So once I start doing this, if I see like the charcoal was kind of in the light was breaking up over it, where I could still see that line in the middle of it, so then I went back just with the eraser tip, it kind of pulled up. So pulling up those light areas, and there's shapes, right? This eye, same thing, I have this really bright edge. It's a little bit lighter off to the side. This little notch in it. And then where it comes up against the nose, that actually gets a little bit darker, but then it spreads out. So this is where I kind of refine all of these shapes. I'm going to lighten this a bit. I got a little heavy-handed. A little bit of a light corner up here. I don't want to go too far with the white at this point. This whole thing will pick up a little bit of light. But just barely. Top of the teeth. Even the bottom edge of the teeth is getting reflected light coming up. All the stuff that happened on the eggs are happening on this. But it's like happening over and over and over again. Like here on the brow, I'm going to have a core shadow and then reflected light. Same thing is going to happen on each tooth. I've got the light on the top of it, where it kind of bends out. Then it gets a little darker in the center, and then I get reflected light hitting the bottom of those teeth. To the canine. sure, keeping things lined up. Skipping over, there's actually a dark right above the tooth where I have that little shelf. So now I'm going to start bringing in the black. Inside of this eye gets really dark in there. Same with the nasal cavity. But I see there's the nasal cavity have all these pieces of bone that come up that kind of break it up, right, into the various pathways the cavity takes, for both nostrils. They're dark. They're darker than what happens with the outside edge, but they're not as dark as these really deep crevices. So those would be things that would probably stay the brown of the paper, or this middle gray that the paper is going to create. And it's easy to see that little bit of because they are quite a bit lighter than what happens with the cavity itself, that it's easy for that you go in and put those and make white on them. And they're really not that light. So this is why you want to kind of pick the lightest areas and darkest areas first and kind of use those as a benchmark as to how dark or light other areas get. Like this starts to get a little bit lighter, comes out. And then the bottom part of that eye socket is actually catching light, so that's another place where it would probably stay the brown of the paper. And then it becomes a lot of like back and forth on it. Doing these little crevices, start picking up some of the texture on that bone. This area has like this dark shadow right above the nose cavity, but there's a little bit of a light edge right here on it where you get a little light bouncing up, but that's going to stay the brown of the paper. So again, it's darker than the areas up here where this is catching light on that texture, but it's not as dark as what happens below it where I have this real deep little crevice. So I keep going. Again, it's kind of back and forth on it. It's easy to start using too much of one. Like once you start drawing with like the black, you just keep going with it, and before you know, the whole thing's black. So you want to have them kind of both in your hands and just kind of flip back and forth as you're going. But you are going to leave. Some of it will stay, a lot of it will stay the white of the paper, or the gray of the paper. Well, the brown of the paper. So this, and the dark on top, where I have this lip on the tooth, that's going to vary, right? Like I've got some places where it gets kind of bigger and kind of fades out. So you don't want to, the last thing you want to do with this is go in and simplify too much. That's why we're taking two classes. So going over the top of the teeth and just going like this with it where you have this even dark line. Or taking these eyebrows that have that kind of check mark shape to them and all these shadows, like where I have a core shadow, then I'd have reflected light coming in on it, taking all of that and just turning it into a big sweeping curve you know, a light curve or something like that. You'll see most of the bottom edge of things will get lighter. Like even here, where this cheekbone extends around to the side, with the white paper underneath this, you're going to get reflected light bouncing up on a lot of these edges. And then the cast shadow, when you get to that point, which should not be tonight, really. I'm going to change this shape a little bit. So you still can manipulate these at this point. Don't feel the need to go. See, the white comes almost up entirely. The black would lighten, but it doesn't come up. But like where I had that light edge was just, it got too wide. I wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. And the white came up completely. The black is still there, but it's very faint. But what I would do with the cast shadow, which in my case kind of extends out this way, is rather than go in and do it black, it's not that dark, I'm going to show it up by doing the white of the table around it, right? So the cast shadow shows up like that. And then this edge would show up not only because it has a little bit of reflected light, but then I also have, like right under the chin, I have this recessed shadow. It's a little darker here, but then it kind of fades out. Okay? And so take your time with them. We're going to spend another class on it. Before you leave, once I change the lights on,